My name is Brett Narlock. I am the Executive Director of the North Dakota Policy Council, the group hosting today's event. And I just wanted to thank everybody for coming right away and talk a little bit about the North Dakota Policy Council, what we do and what we believe. And among a lot of other things, we like to host lunches like this. We host, about half a dozen a year or so, where we like to bring policy to the public. And we like to bring experts such as Mr. O'Toole and talk about some of the issues that are on the forefront of the state's political scene. What we try to do is enter into the discourse, the public discourse, alternative ideas that are based on limited government, individual responsibility, privatization, those kinds of things. Whereas usually the ideas that we hear come from government agencies or various different interest groups, and those tend to, don't always take the public interest into account. And so we like to offer alternatives that are, like I said before, based on limited government and kind of non-intervention. And about a month ago, the North Dakota Republican Party had a lunch. I think it was in this actual room. And they were talking about the development that's going on in the Bakken oil formation out in the western part of the state. And I forget the gentleman's name, but they had a speaker from, I believe he was a county commissioner from Williams County. And he came in and he talked at length about a lot of the problems, a lot of the growing pains that exist in the western part of the state because there's a shortage of housing and the roads are crumbling and whereas at one time you could look out and just watch the sunset over some hills, and now you see oil rigs and that kind of thing. And he really talked about the negative aspects of the rapid growth that we're seeing out there. But one thing in particular that he said that really got me thinking, it's actually the reason why we're hosting this lunch, is because, he said, people are going to start looking for plans, for ideas, to manage the growth in the oil patch. And he said the group or the people who come up with the first plan, the first ideas are going to win. It doesn't matter what those ideas are or what philosophy underpins them, but the first idea is going to win because they're just looking for something. So that kind of got my mind churning, and I thought, well, why don't we become a group that puts out some of the first ideas? And we can base them on the idealism of the founders of the country, which is that the private sector can take care of these problems. Growth can be managed by the private sector, by individuals acting voluntarily in the marketplace. And we hope that this policy lunch is the first step in adding these ideas to the public discourse. Randal O'Toole is a Cato Institute senior fellow working on urban growth, public land, and transportation issues. He's written numerous books, including Reforming the Forest Service, The Vanishing Automobile and Other Urban Myths, Gridlock, Why We're Stuck in Traffic and What to Do About It. But the book of his that I enjoy the most is called The Best Laid Plans. And actually, he has a few copies out in front of the registration table. I think he saw them for about $15. So if you're interested, pick one up. But in that book, O'Toole calls for repealing federal, state, and local planning laws and proposes reforms that can help solve social and environmental problems without heavy-handed government regulation. And I can't think of anyone better on these topics to come and talk to you guys today in light of the expanding growth in the western part of the state than Mr. Randal O'Toole.
I'm going to move up here so I can control my computer because I supposedly have this great Wi-Fi thing going, but it never works right for remote control. But I have a blog. It's called The Anti-Planner. And you're going to find out today why I call myself the Anti-Planner. I'm not too fond of government planners. Everybody plans. We plan our vacations, we plan our educations, we plan our careers, we plan our families, but we're flexible in our plans. If rich Uncle Joe calls us up and says, hey, come to Hawaii with me for Christmas, we don't say, sorry, I'm supposed to be doing my laundry that day. I can't go because my plan is too strict. We're flexible. Government plans are not like that. Government plans are very inflexible because as soon as government writes a plan, you generate special interest groups that work to try to keep that plan intact because they benefit from it. Even if it turns out the plan is a failure, they'll do everything they can to make sure the plan doesn't change. Now, North Dakota has not had too many problems with planners outside of Fargo, really, because North Dakota's population hasn't been growing very fast. Interestingly, if you look, after 1900, North Dakota population, actually after about 1880, North Dakota's population was growing very, very fast, and nobody back in those days said we needed to have planners, we needed to have zoning, we needed to have government regulation to fuel all this growth. The growth just happened. North Dakota's population peaked at about 680,000 people in 1930, and since then has been either downward or up and down, and only in the last decade have you seen any kind of real growth again. And now it's the 2010 census said about 672,000 people, so not quite the 1930 peak. Now, that growth has led to some stress. And the stress has led to people opportunistically saying, let's do something about it. The first thing they do is they try to create a crisis. Oh my God, we've got all these people moving in, what are we going to do? And the crisis ends up being more and more comical because I hear the same things, whether we're talking about Houston, which is growing at 100,000 people a year, or North Dakota, which is growing at a couple thousand people a year. I hear the same kinds of stresses about how terrible the growth is going to be and why we need to have, I have a plan. Why somebody has a plan to take care of that growth. To listen to the planners, you would think they were super planners. That they have all kinds of superpowers like precognition. They could correctly predict the future for the next 50 years. And we see cities writing 50-year plans. And even Vancouver, BC was writing a 100-year plan. Nobody knows what the future is going to be tomorrow, much less 100 years from now. They have perfect knowledge of individual tastes. They know what everybody wants and needs. And so we can rely on them to provide us with our wants and needs. They have perfect knowledge of the best use of everybody's property. They know how your land should be used. They know better than you, that's for sure, because the prescriptions they write might be very different from what you want to do with your property. Andres Duwani is a Florida planning guru who says the plan should be so tight that landowners shouldn't have any ability to do anything with their land except what the planners tell them, and the only thing they might vary is the architectural detail. Now, I could give you story after story about how these kinds of plans have led to disasters. I'm just going to tell you one story. I'm going to tell you several stories, but one general story. At the end of World War II, America had not built much housing for 15 years. It had 10 years of depression and 5 years of war, and our housing was in a terrible shape. We had lots of people living in cramped, dilapidated housing. And so economists said that we needed 9 million new homes built by 1955. And so the federal government passed a law to create public housing. They said, we're going to build 800,000, actually they said 8 million new units of housing by 1955. We're going to build 10%. The government is going to build 10% of all the housing needed in order to meet that demand, and especially meet it for poor people. A lot of the new housing was built in the form of high-rises because it was cheap and because it was dense, and property owners benefited from that density, and it was thought to be cheap. Actually, it turned out to be very expensive. These high-rises were built at approximately the cost of luxury high-rise housing, and yet they were for low-income people. To save money, the elevators only stopped at every third floor. the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th floors. So it was an 11-story building. 2/3 of the people had to walk up or down a flight of stairs. Because of this and other problems, the buildings proved to be unlivable, and it was just within just a few years after they were built, they ended up imploding them all and destroying them completely. It was a complete waste. By 1955, although they had set a target of building 800,000 new public homes, the government had only managed to build about 300,000 new homes between 1945 and 1955. The private sector built more than 10 million new homes, far more than the economists thought were needed back at the end of the war. So the private sector stepped up and met the demand. Government got in the way. Now, that's at the national level. At the local level, we see 4 different kinds of planning in this country. The first kind of planning is what I would call simple zoning, where the cities zone what's to be done in the city, and almost inevitably they overzone for certain uses and underzone for others. Typically, landowners think, well, if I have a business on my land, it'll be worth more than if I have single-family homes. If I have multifamily housing, it'll be worth more. So they lobby to get more land zoned for multifamily housing or commercial, and they let less land for industrial or single family. So they end up with a surplus of multifamily and commercial, which means actually the people who own that land are not making more money because there's too much of it. And then there's a shortage of single family and industrial. This happened in a lot of cities, not everywhere, but a lot of cities. Now, it's all right if you just zone the city, because if you're a developer and there's a shortage of single-family housing, you just go outside the city limits and build your single-family homes there and sell them to people, and then maybe they'll eventually be annexed. But in the meantime, you've been able to meet the demand. So the next step is to do county-wide zoning. My home state of Oregon mandated that every county zone every acre in the county in 1969. I think it was the first state to do so. Today there are still some states that forbid counties from zoning at all. There are some states where it's optional, but in most states it's mandatory to do zoning. Now, once counties are required to zone, the cities, and cities usually population-wise dominate the county, the cities come in and try to control that zoning to benefit themselves. So here, for example, is San Jose. The white area is San Jose, and the colored area is county outside the city limits of San Jose. It's Santa Clara County. And in 1974, Santa Clara County and San Jose together decided to put an urban growth boundary around the city so that you can't build outside the city limits, outside the urban growth boundary. And that led to housing becoming very expensive. They adopted what's called a slow growth plan, where they limited the number of permits allowed each year, and housing prices just skyrocketed. Now, planners looked at that and they said, well, that's really unfair to have slow growth plans because low-income people don't have a place to live. So they came up with a new kind of planning they call smart growth. Portland, Oregon, my former hometown, has a smart growth plan. Now, like San Jose, it has an urban growth boundary. You can see the city, and then the red area is the urban growth boundary. There's about 23 other cities inside the urban growth boundary, cities like Gresham and Tigard and Beaverton. And then outside the urban growth boundary in Oregon, throughout the state, you are not allowed to build a single house on your own land unless you have at least 80 acres, you actually farm it, and you actually earn $80,000 a year farming it. If you don't meet those conditions, you cannot even build a house on your land. Now, inside the boundary, they decided we don't want to expand the boundary. Instead, we want to densify. We want to have higher density housing inside the boundary for two reasons. First of all, that would mean there would be less farmland to be converted to urban land. And second of all, they had the idea that if it was denser, that fewer people would drive. And planners don't like cars. Planners hate driving, and so if they made it denser, there'd be less driving. So they took neighborhoods of single-family homes and rezoned them for apartments. It was minimum density zoning. They said if you have a vacant lot, you can't build a single-family home on it. You have to build apartments. If your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it. You have to replace it with apartments or leave it vacant. You can't rebuild a single-family home.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
When did they do this?
In the mid-90s, mid-1990s. They also took some single-family neighborhoods and they gave them incentives to densify. Here's a single-family home on a 100 by 100 lot, about a quarter-acre lot. And they gave the developers a tax break. If they had put in higher density housing, they get 10 years of property tax waivers on the housing. So the developer tore the house down and subdivided the lot into four 25-foot wide lots and put 4 15-foot wide houses called skinny houses on the lot. My father says it's a good thing there's a back door because once you get in the front door, it's too narrow to turn around in. But even that wasn't dense enough. They decided for real density, they needed to have 4 and 5-story apartment buildings like this one. Now, actually that one's not in Portland. That one is in East Germany. It was built during the Soviet era. Here's the one in Portland. It's very different. The difference is that as soon as the East Germans got their freedom, they all moved out to single-family homes, and so the building I showed you was scheduled to be torn down when I took that picture. Whereas in Portland, we've lost our freedom to buy affordable single-family homes, so people are having to live in places like this. Now, this happens to be right next to a light rail station, so they figure they don't need to put in much parking. They put in less than 2/3 of a parking place per dwelling unit. When you see those cars parked there, that red sign says no parking. This is a fire lane. See those cars parked there? That red stripe shows the outline of the sidewalk. They're parking on the sidewalk. The managers of the apartment know that if they enforce the parking rules, people will move out. So the idea that this is a less driving development is just absurd. In fact, if you stand outside and count the number of people taking light rail every morning versus getting in their cars and driving every morning, it's not really any different than anywhere else in the city. So, to promote this density, they give 10-year property tax exemptions, which means $1 million condominiums in downtown Portland pay $140 of taxes a year. That's taxes on the land. You don't have to pay on the improvement. But that wasn't enough to get the density they wanted. So now they use what's called tax increment financing. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what tax increment financing is? A couple people don't? Basically, tax increment financing is where they steal money from schools, fire, libraries, and other things and use it for development. What they claim is they're only taking the taxes on the new development and taking those taxes and using it to subsidize the development. Like, say, if the county tax assessor came to your home and said, I want you to put a new addition onto your home, and we're going to take all the property taxes for the next 30 years that will charge you for that new addition and give it to you now to subsidize that new addition. That's what tax increment financing is. And they say it's free money because you wouldn't get the new development without the tax increment financing. Now, study after study has shown that you get that new development whether you've got the tax increment financing. You just might not get it in that specific location, but you get it somewhere. Well, Portland has given about $2 billion in tax increment financing to developers to get these high-density developments. And that's just the city of Portland. The suburbs of Portland are also doing tax increment financing, and they've got a lot more. A study of tax increment financing in Illinois found that cities that use it actually grow slower than cities that don't, because they effectively put a higher tax burden or provide a lower level of urban services. In Portland, what we've done is we've stripped the schools, we've stripped the police, we've stripped the libraries of their budgets in order to provide this tax increment financing, these subsidies for developers. Now, what happens is you get what's called crony capitalism, because you get a few people handing out millions of dollars in money. And here's the champion of crony capitalism, former Mayor Daley of Chicago. And they had dozens and dozens of tax increment finance districts all over Chicago. His predecessor, Mayor Washington, who was an African-American mayor, started tax increment financing in Chicago to help some of the minority districts improve. But Daley started putting it in the wealthy districts because that's where the political power was. So they'd use all this tax increment financing. They actually had school teachers in a protest march in Chicago protesting tax increment financing. They barged into a auto dealer that had received $2.5 million in subsidies and demanded their money back as a way of protesting tax increment financing. Now in North Dakota and most other states that allow tax increment financing, you have to show that the area is blighted and would not be developed if you didn't have the tax increment financing. Well, in Illinois, there was a shopping mall that they claimed was blighted so that they could give it a few $1 million in subsidies to remodel the shopping mall. Wisconsin actually took a cornfield and claimed it was blighted so that they could use tax increment financing to develop the cornfield. There are some companies that have specialized in taking advantage of cities that are giving out tax increment financing. Bass Pro has accepted over $500 million in tax increment finance subsidies from cities across the country. Cabela's has accepted close to $500 million in tax increment finance money. Now, Cabela's is the largest sporting goods chain in America. Bass Pro is second. The third is Gander Mountain. The president and CEO of Gander Mountain is a free market believer who has opposed tax increment financing subsidies either for his company or for his competitors, and he has fought those subsidies. So I do my shopping at Gander Mountain. Now we all know recently Californians elected a great fiscal conservative, Jerry Moonbeam Brown, to be governor. The first thing he did, tax increment financing was invented in California, and by 2010 it was leaching $5 billion out of the state government every year. Now how was it taken from the state government? Well, the local governments were using tax increment financing to take money from the schools, and the state was required to make up that money. And so he figured out if we get rid of tax increment financing, which he had used when he was mayor of Oakland, but as governor he didn't like it, if we got rid of it, it would save the state billions of dollars a year. Since they had a huge deficit, he managed to persuade the legislature to abandon tax increment financing. So California was the first state to start it. It was the first state to get rid of it. Let's hope more states do so. Now, housing isn't the only problem with planning. There are other problems for businesses and problems with traffic congestion. Just to mention one problem, Columbia Sportswear is the largest company that was still headquartered in Portland, Oregon. Most of the big companies in Portland had moved out, like Georgia Pacific and Louisiana Pacific. They complained about how Oregon had an anti-business environment. And at the time, I thought they were just talking. But then Columbia Sportswear, located in North Portland, decided they needed a bigger headquarters. They were growing and they needed to have more room for their people. They found a place in a tax increment finance district that Portland wanted to redevelop. They bought the land, they got the permits to build, and then the city's transit agency said, you can't put in a parking lot there because it's next to a light rail station. We don't allow parking lots next to our light rail stations. I said, well, that's great, except for there's no light rail station. What are you talking about? Well, we don't have one there yet, but we plan to build one someday. Oh, really? What plan is that? Well, that's the plan the voters rejected in 1998, but we plan to do it anyway someday. So they moved out of Portland, and are no longer a Portland business, another business driven out by the planners. Okay, I've talked about zoning, I've talked about slow growth, and I've talked about smart growth. The kind of planning I like is no government planning. And the best example of that is Houston. Houston has no zoning. In Texas, counties aren't allowed to zone. Many of Houston's suburbs have zoning, but typically what happens is somebody will acquire some land. This is a 10,500 acre tract. You see the borders are irregular. And then the owner of the tract will plan it. You can see the red areas are multifamily, the yellow areas are commercial, and the green areas are parks, and then the light areas, mostly in the bottom, are single-family homes. And they will put in all the infrastructure. They'll put in the sewers, the water, the roads, the parks, and everything. And then, after it's developed, it might be annexed into a town, which might zone it. But in lieu of zoning, they put in protective covenants and protect it. The houses they build are beautiful. They're very affordable. It's the most affordable large city in America. $160,000 house here, brand new. Lots of nice parks, lots of amenities. They've got a giant water park for those people who don't like the heat. And then they put in all these protective covenants and they create homeowner associations. And the homeowner associations are allowed to change the covenants if they want to. So the community can evolve with changing tastes and changing desires. In Houston, about half the housing in the city is under a protective covenant and half is not. But if you're not under a protective covenant, you can petition your neighbors, and if 75% of them agree, you can create a homeowner association and write your own protective covenant. So you can control what happens in your neighborhood, but you don't have any say for what happens outside of your neighborhood. Well, one of the things that this means is that it's really easy for developers and home builders to respond to changes in demand for housing. For example, in Houston, you can buy land, and from the day you close on the land, you can go out and get all the permits you need, contract with a builder, build the property, and move in within 120 days of when you closed on the land. In Atlanta, which has zoning but no, not smart growth or slow growth, it takes about a year or so to get all those permits and to build. In Portland, it takes 2.5 years, and in San Jose, it takes close to 5 years just to build one house. And that's just to get the permits. It can take actually longer to build. So that kind of delay makes it really hard to respond to changes in demand. This is why housing prices have gone up so much in San Jose and a lot in Portland, but they didn't go up much in Houston. Houston, this is a 2,200 square foot home. This is what I call a Caldwell Banker house, because every year Caldwell Banker estimates the cost of a 2,200 square foot, 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath house with a family room, a 2-car garage, and a pleasant lot, and in a neighborhood that's suitable for a middle manager. That's how they describe it. That house in Houston, about $170,000. Bismarck, about $200,000. Whoops, I went too fast there. $200,000 in Bismarck. Portland, about $350,000. Now, today's prices, after the crash of the bubble, in San Jose, $650,000. At the peak of the bubble, $1.4 million in San Jose. So, it's still way too expensive in San Jose, and here's the prices again. Minot, Bismarck are about the same. Now, somebody sat down and compared San Jose with, they didn't choose Houston, they chose Dallas. And they said, part of the problem is because San Jose has urban growth boundaries, the cost of the land is a lot higher. A 2,500 square foot lot in San Jose cost almost $250,000, whereas a 7,000 square foot lot in Dallas cost only about $25,000. Impact fees are a big cost. And the problem with impact fees is if you decide to pay for your infrastructure with impact fees, you charge the new people, but everybody else has to pay more too, because the owners of existing homes see that the cost of a new house has gone up by the impact fee, so they raise the prices of their houses too, because that's their competition, is the new houses. So everybody ends up paying more for housing, and you get windfall profits going to the owners of existing homes. The permit cost is about $100,000 more. That's the cost of the extra time it takes to get the permit and the risk that you won't get one even after you spend all the time trying to get it. And then because it's so much more expensive to live in San Jose than in Dallas, labor adds about $40,000 to $50,000 more to the cost of the house. Now, as I say, in Houston, all the infrastructure is built by the developer, and the developer typically takes a long-term loan or sells a long-term bond and pays it off by assessing the home buyers every year for 30 years. So it doesn't add to the price of the house. Whereas in places that use impact fees, you're adding to the price of the houses everywhere. Now, in communities that have made housing unaffordable, the first thing they always do is they say, oh, well, let's create an affordable housing mandate. Sometimes it's called inclusionary zoning, where they require developers to sell or rent housing at below market rates, usually below cost, to compensate for the high and unaffordable housing. And they'll say 15% of all your homes have to be below cost, or 20%. Well, studies have shown, including this study, which was published by the Reason Foundation, but was written by economists from San Jose State University, found that when you mandate affordable housing, you make housing less affordable. The same thing is true with rent controls. When you mandate rent controls, you make rents less affordable. How does that work? Because nobody's going to build when you've got rent controls. When you have affordable housing mandates, they found the amount of new homes built plummeted in cities after they passed affordable housing mandates. So housing became less affordable. Now, the advocates of planning say we need to have planning to keep urban services affordable. And there's a study that was published in 2000 called The Cost of Sprawl. And they estimated that the cost of urban services to low-density suburbs was about $11,000 per home greater than the cost to higher-density areas. Now, I have a lot of questions about this report. I think they used a lot of hypothetical numbers, and they weren't very realistic. But even if it is $11,000 per home, it turns out that's a lot cheaper than the cost of planning. When you plan, you make housing more expensive, and I call that the planning tax. The Twin Cities, $15,000 per home. Denver, $40,000. You can see the numbers. Boulder and San Jose are more because they tend to be slow growth plans. The Twin Cities, Denver, and Portland are smart growth plans. But whatever you do, it makes housing more expensive. Now, curiously, you don't see private companies saying, we're not going to provide services to you because you're too far away. Instead, they say, we'll provide services to you if it's profitable to us. And there might be a slight surcharge for UPS to deliver a package to you if you live out in a rural area or a remote suburb. Or there might be, telephone service or electrical service might be a cost a little more. But they'll do it. They're not going to try to dictate how you should live. But instead, we see government planners, instead of saying, we just want cost recovery, they say, we're going to dictate that people have to live here and not here. And it's not just living. Recently in Britain, a report came out written by an associate of the Prime Minister demanding that all new stores be in downtown. No new grocery stores, not even flea markets, will be allowed in the suburbs. They all have to be downtown. That idea, I'm sure, will jump across the ocean pretty fast. Now, it's not just me saying this. Lots of economists have found that land use regulation makes housing less affordable. And not just less affordable. This is by Edward Glaser. He's one of the leading urban economists in the world. He's at Harvard University. He says it makes housing less affordable, but it also makes housing prices more volatile. They go up and down instead of on an even keel. And you end up with driving employers away, so you have losses of employment and income. And he says you end up creating boutique cities catering only to an elite. Now, here's recent housing prices in cities that have lots of planning. In Florida and California, they had housing bubbles, right? Whereas if you go to cities that have minimal amounts of planning, like Houston and Dallas, and Omaha and Kansas City, and Raleigh, North Carolina, They didn't have a bubble. If all cities in America had been like Houston, we wouldn't have had a housing bubble, we wouldn't have had a credit crisis, we wouldn't have had a financial meltdown in 2008. So I have a paper out you can download called How Urban Planners Caused the Housing Bubble and the Financial Meltdown. Now, as far as boutique cities catering only to an elite, it turns out in the United States, about a third of American families earn less than $50,000 a year. About a third are between $50,000 and $100,000, and about a third are more than $100,000 a year. In San Francisco, though, well over half earn more than $100,000 a year, and only about 20% earn under $50,000, and another 20% $50,000 to $100,000. Now, San Francisco says, well, that's because we're such a wonderful place to live. We've attracted all these wealthy people. But the reality is, no, what they've done is they've pushed out the moderate and low-income people. The number of blacks, the number of other minorities living in San Francisco is declining because they can't afford to live there. They're actually moving to other places. And so you end up with people taking 80-mile commutes to work because they can't afford to live in or near the city that they work in. Now, one city that has taken a different approach to development in a regulated environment is Anaheim, which, like most cities in California, has heavy land use regulations. And they had a neighborhood that they wanted to develop. It's called the Triangle because it's located between three freeways that form a triangle. And instead of using tax increment financing, which is what most other California cities do when they want to redevelop, this was kind of a warehouse district that was no longer needed for warehouses anymore. They decided to relax all the land use planning. Basically, they said, anything goes. You can build anything you want. All you have to do is make basic building codes and do what you want. Within a few years, they got $18 billion of new development. They got stores, they got housing, they got hotels, they got all kinds of things because they relaxed the developing code. They didn't have to subsidize it at all compared with other cities in California that are doing all kinds of subsidies and not getting anywhere near that kind of growth. Well, all of these stories are described in more detail in my book, Best Laid Plans, which, as Brett says, I have a few copies with me. I thought it was the most pertinent one for today. The list price is $24, but today only you can get it for $15 if I don't run out. Actually, you can get it for free, but the autograph is $15. I also have a lot of publications on this subject, on tax increment financing, on the problems with urban planning and housing prices, on the problems in Portland, the problems in San Jose. Just go to the Cato.org website. You can download those papers for free. As I mentioned, my blog is called The Anti-Planner. You can Google Anti-Planner, and I'm the first thing on the list. Or go to ti.org for the blog, cato.org/policy analysis to get more directly to my papers. American Dream Coalition also has some of my papers. And I have a newsletter, but it's mostly on transportation issues. I send it out about once a month. If you're interested, just give me your email address and I'll put you on the list.
How about the trees? The tree book.
The forestry book? That was written a long time ago. Most of it I still agree with. There's a few things that I'd have to change because I've learned new things since then. But it's kind of out of print. I do have a few copies with it at home that if somebody wants to buy them. But it's about the Forest Service. I know the Forest Service has some national grasslands in North Dakota. Out west, the Forest Service is very important. I live 1,500 feet from a national forest. What I found was that the Forest Service, Congress had given the Forest Service budgetary incentives to lose money on environmentally destructive activities. And particularly to clear cut, but also do other things that were environmentally destructive. The more destruction they did, the bigger the budget they got. I was surprised, I wrote the book in 1988, and I was surprised that the Forest Service actually read and responded to the book, and they don't do as much environmental damage anymore. I think they realized they did not want to be victims of those kind of incentives. Well, the truth is, foresters here don't have much respect for what happens in Germany either. Germany, I mean, forests here, especially public forests, are multiple-use forests. They're used for wildlife and watershed and timber and things like that. Germany is definitely single-use. They manicure the forests only for the timber. They're not all that great for recreation. The wildlife is decimated.